we go ahead and get started? First of all, welcome everybody, and thank you for braving this wonderful weather outside. So we very much appreciate the effort that you've made to join us today. My name is Philip Benoit, and I am an adjunct senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I'm leading the center's work on energy for development. And tonight we're going to hear from Johannes Urpelainen about his new book entitled Escaping the Energy Poverty Trap, When and How Governments Power the Lives of the Poor. And we're also going to hear from Michelle Keane, who's a senior development specialist at the World Bank. But more broadly today provides an opportunity to talk about a critical issue in the development area, namely the issue of providing access to the extreme poor. Let me first quickly say that this event, like all those at the center, is being webcast live, and the full video will be available on our website in the coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists at any time using the hashtag CGAP-events and our Twitter handle at Columbia University. What I'd like to do now is just briefly present our two panelists. Johannes is the Director and Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy Resources and Environment and Founding Director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, Energy Resources and Environment at SAIS. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan, and more importantly, he spent the next 8 years working here at Columbia University, so welcome back, Johannes. He is also a fellow with the Center on Global Energy Policy, so it's a pleasure to have Johannes back here with us. He's the author of many books and focuses very much on the issues of transformational change and what is required in those specific areas. As the founding director of ISEP, Johannes is responsible for the vision, strategy, and general management of the initiative, and it's one that has grown a lot under your leadership, so congratulations on that. We also have Michelle Keane, who is a World Bank program manager, a senior expert at the World Bank who's had a distinguished career there spanning 20 years. She's focused on Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, as well as the Latin America region. Michelle has a Bachelor of Arts, unfortunately not from Columbia, it's from Princeton, but that's okay, we won't hold it against you. And a master's degree in European Political and Governance Studies. Michelle is often called upon at the World Bank to manage very sensitive issues, and so, for example, following the earthquake in Haiti, Michelle became the program manager to direct the World Bank's large reconstruction activities in Haiti over the next several years, and is now currently working on the St. Martin Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience Trust Fund, which also looks at a variety of very important reconstruction issues following natural disasters. So before we actually get into this panel discussion and presentation, again, for those watching online, my name is Philip Benoit, and I am here with Johannes Urpelainen, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and Michelle Keane, who is a World Bank program manager. So as I had mentioned a little earlier, we are discussing the issue of energy access framed around this book launch, Escaping the Energy Poverty, but more importantly, more fundamentally, this issue about how we can improve access to energy, and specifically how we can deal with the issue of the lack of access. Just to give you a sense of how this is going to work, Johannes will give a presentation of about 25 minutes, and then he'll be followed by Michelle, who, as a discussant, will raise a variety of points relating not only to Johannes's book and the research in there, but also to the issues more broadly regarding access. For those of you who are here in the room, after that we'll open the session up to questions and answers. I have a few questions as well for the panel. For those of you who are here in person, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring a mic to you at your seat. And for those of you who are watching online, Again, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy to ask a question. Now, just by way of background, to place this, I think, in an important broader context, as you know, there are about 1 billion people today in the world who don't have access to electricity. There are about 2.7 billion people in the world who don't have access to clean cooking technologies. Now, why is this such a critical issue? I think really there are two major reasons. One is, from my personal perspective, in a world that has so much riches, it is fundamentally a moral issue that we have so many who lack basic access to energy. At the same time, what we also see is a lot of overlap between those who lack access to these forms of energy and the extreme poor. There are still about 750 million people in the world today who qualify as living in extreme poverty. That basically means less than $2 a day per person. And what we see, obviously, is a lot of overlap between the extreme poor and those who lack access. But obviously, $2 a day is de minimis for many of those who continue to lack access. They also suffer many of the perils and problems that face the poor in terms of health, poor health, poor education, and the like. Now, we've seen a lot of progress in terms of access over the last 10 years. For example, 1 billion people have been connected to electricity. 2.5 billion have gained access to electricity over the last 25 years. Now, having said that, in terms of clean cooking, we haven't seen as much progress, and I think that's something we'll touch upon in this session. I think something that was very encouraging was in 2015, the United Nations decided to include universal access by 2030 as one of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 7. That was a very important political statement, a recognition by the world that this is fundamentally a development imperative, one that is critical to any attempt to fight poverty. Having said that, when we look forward, a lot of projections point to uneven progress. On the one hand, for example, the International Energy Agency projects that by 2025, India should have achieved universal access, and I know this is something that we're going to talk about in Johannes's book. But by 2030, they also estimate that under current policies and practices, we'll still be looking at 700 million people without access. 12, 15 years from now, still be looking at 700 million people without access. Most of them really centered in sub-Saharan African countries. Now, there has been a lot of discussion in terms of best ways to provide access to people. A lot of that has focused on the need for financing. There's been a lot of discussion about the role of the private sector. The United States, for example, pushed forward its Power Africa program, which focuses very much on private sector role. There's a lot of discussion about delivery mechanisms and the like. There's also the issue about how much access are we talking about? Is it simply a question of providing people with a couple of lights, or is there a need really to provide people with enough access to electricity to enable them to convert that access into incomes to help raise them out of poverty? And finally, there's a lot of discussion in the access world, a surprising amount, I would say, and we'll come back to this, on the issue of climate change and choice of technology. Is it important to push access through renewables, or can coal or other fossil fuels provide an important role in providing access? And at the end of the day, is that the right type of choice to be made? So there have been a lot of discussions about a variety of issues, but I think what we're going to be looking at today, and I'm very grateful to Johannes for his book and the research in this regard, is some of the fundamentals of what are some of the key preconditions in order to get access to those who need it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Johannes to get us started on this very important issue. Johannes?
Okay, first of all, thanks to the Center for hosting me. It's been a real pleasure continuing here as a non-resident fellow. I used to be a faculty affiliate while I was still here at Columbia, so I'm just in a different role. And of course to Philip and Michelle for joining me on this panel, all of you for coming on a day like this. I'm kind of impressed that so many people came to see talk about energy access today. So as Philip already mentioned, what I'm really going to talk about is the fundamentals of of this energy access issue. I'm a political scientist by training, so the key question we try to answer in this book is what makes governments exert real effort to solve this problem of energy access, and what are the conditions under which they would succeed in doing so. And the starting point here is just, it's useful to have some kind of a basic understanding of what the map of energy access looks like. This is a picture that's from 2016, so this is a few years back. There's been some changes, but by and large, the picture is about what it is. So if you look at this picture, of course, the industrialized Western countries, we can safely ignore them. North America, Europe, tend to have 100% access to modern energy, both cooking fuels and electricity. The same is true also of the post-Soviet countries. It turns out that in those countries, universal electrification also happened well before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So those countries are not what we are going to be looking at. The issues historically over the past 60, 70 years have been in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Latin America today is very close to having solved the electricity access problem. You can still find areas in the Amazon, in some of the remote areas where you have people living without electricity at home, but electrification rates in general are very close to 100% in all major economies in Latin America. In Asia, the picture is a little uneven. China is very close to 100%. You can only find a handful of communities in some western parts of the country where you don't have electricity, but those are quite special cases because of geography and other conditions. The problems are more in South Asia. So India, nobody really knows exactly how many people have electricity in India because the government had this recent Saubhagya scheme, which brought the electrification rate from something like 85% in 2017 to over 90% now, but we don't actually have any reliable statistics on how many people exactly have electricity there. The biggest problem by far is in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's going to be the area where we'll find the last people without electricity access, without doubt. It's one of those areas where with current trends, population growth is approximately negating any of the gains with increased electrification rates. So the number of people without electricity is actually either about the same or growing in the coming years in sub-Saharan Africa because of population growth and slow progress in electrification. If we now look at cooking, the situation is more challenging. So Latin America, you find many countries where access to clean cooking fuels, so basically alternatives to firewood, are actually quite limited. In China also, large segments of the rural population still cook with coal, with firewood, and so on. In India, majority of people now have access to liquefied petroleum gas, which is the most popular clean cooking fuel in the country, but most of them still continue to use firewood. It's called fuel stacking. You continue to use the traditional alternative even though you have the modern alternative. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, in many countries, it's just a few percent of the population who have access to modern cooking fuels. So cooking fuels, like Philip already said, we have a very long way to go, and we are making very little progress. It's much more challenging than electricity, and I think in our book we can propose one possible explanation for why this would be the case. So what we do in the book is first of all, we start with some really fundamental, almost physical predictors of energy access. It is easier to help people gain energy access when population densities are high. So a country like India has an easier time doing this than a country like Ethiopia or Sudan, where the population densities are very low. Wealth helps a lot. So the more money people have, the better the economy is doing, the better electrification and cooking fuel access happen. You don't find in industrialized countries people without this access anymore. Geography is also important beyond population density. So if you have kind of flat terrain, ideally combined with things like hydroelectric resources, conveniently located, that makes the job a lot easier than if you have very complicated terrain. So for example, Brazil electrification rate is over 99% now, but there's still 1 million people somewhere in the Amazon who don't have these resources, which is maybe not surprising when it takes 6 hours on a plane to reach some of these villages and there is no other way to reach them. Okay? So you can see that these fundamentals are there. Once you take these fundamentals and you kind of adjust your expectations for them, the question remains, so why are some countries making more progress than others compared to where they should be? I've already told you that every very wealthy country has solved this problem, and every very poor country has not. No very poor country has managed to solve this problem. But what about the countries in the middle? Why do we see some countries making significant progress at certain times? Why are others falling behind? That's what we try to do then, drawing on political science and political economy theories. And the first question we ask, does the government actually have any real interest in solving this problem? It's not an obvious question, so governments react to political and economic incentives, and in many cases they really don't have much interest in solving this problem. If you think of, for example, South Africa before the end of the apartheid, when you had this very stark divide between the white minority and the African majority, the government really had no interest at all because the black population had no vote. They could not in any way influence the political outcomes in the country. So there was no interest at all among the white government in solving this problem. In other cases, despite the lack of kind of democratic incentives, you still see governments making investments, and that's partly for economic reasons. Electricity can be useful in promoting rural development, and in some cases that is very important. In some countries, what we've seen, for example, is that rural electrification is driven by concerns with irrigation. India is one example where governments basically invest in electrifying the countryside so that they can pump groundwater so that they can deal with their food security problems. Because we've seen that in many countries, governments get overthrown because food prices increase, food security problems drive the governments to do this, regardless of whether they have any kind of democratic political system in place. And then, of course, democratic politics. So in many countries, we also see this pattern where some energy access issues actually become really salient in the politics. We've seen this in India again as one example. I use India a lot as an example because that's where I do my own work, so I have a lot of stories to tell you about India. We've also seen this same story in Brazil. The Brazilian Constitution, 1988, explicitly says that every Brazilian needs to have access to electricity. How did that get there? I don't know. But when you do something like that, you can guarantee that it's going to come up in the elections. And in fact, it has many times. In Chile, when the Pinochet dictatorship ended and it was replaced by a democratic government, one of the very first things they promised to everybody is that we are going to complete the electrification of the country. Pinochet had ignored the rural areas and only focused on the major cities. So politics is another key reason. Now, if government has interest, that's when things start to happen. In our research, we did not find any cases where kind of a purely external intervention would help. So the private sector can sometimes play a role, and we'll discuss this more in our panel, but unless there is some kind of government commitment in at least making things happen, at least facilitating, we think it's very hard to make any progress. If the government has the interest, then we found evidence that there's two key factors that drive progress in energy access. One of them is fairly obvious, so that's institutional capacity. If you lack any kind of capacity to do things on the ground, then electrification, clean cooking infrastructure, these things are very difficult to achieve. Because in the end, these are frontline issues. These are issues where you have to put some money, staff on the ground, you have to build things, you have to manage things. If you lack the capacity, you just can't do it. It's not one of those things where just, let's say, putting some policies on paper, reducing trade tariffs, allowing competition, those things don't generally solve the problem because in the end you need some kind of public investment. These are not typically money-making, profitable investments in the short run. They're social investment designed to help people who are often very poor and who cannot afford to pay for their own infrastructure. The second one is maybe a little less clear, and that's local accountability mechanisms. This was something that really came out of the case studies that we did, this idea that if you want to make rapid progress in difficult conditions, it is very important to achieve two goals in your relationship with the local population. One of them is information, so you need to understand what are the needs and preferences of the population. And then the second thing is to have some kind of an accountability mechanism where the local population has an ability to challenge and to hold accountable the decision makers for their outcomes. Now, the reason why I say that this is not entirely obvious is that if you look at the history of, for example, rural electrification, most of the efforts made have been entirely top-down and centralized. People have treated this as an infrastructure problem where you just install power poles, draw some wires, and you're done. And it turns out that doesn't work. So we've seen that that effort tends to result often, for example, in high levels of village electrification and very low levels of household electrification within the villages. So that's how we started looking at this local accountability, and we found a pretty strong pattern where countries that had these mechanisms either in place because of their other institutional commitments or they created them as part of these programs tend to do much better than countries that take the top-down centralized approach. So India is a good example of this. In India, the electrification scenario is basically one where the poorer northern states have lagged behind. They face difficulties. They're now finally getting around to solving this problem with very generous support from the central government, whereas the wealthier southern and western states, as you can see in this map, have made rapid progress already before these new government programs. And from our perspective, if you think of how this happened, we can take a long historical view of this, going back to 1947, which is when India became an independent country with the partition from Pakistan and independence of the British colony. So when India started in 1947, electrification was really not a priority for the government. There was some lip service paid to agricultural development and so on, but historical research shows that the Congress party that ruled India at that time had a very strong urban bias. They were very interested in developing the urban areas, industry. They looked at the Soviet Union as the model of development. They wanted to have steel factories, chemicals, cement, things like this, which seems like a somewhat strange idea if you start with a country that has no capital at all, but that was the thinking at that time. Government interest was very limited. Institutional capacity was almost non-existent. There was really no frontline bureaucratic capacity outside the areas. India had a very capable administrative service that it had inherited from the British, but it did not have this capacity to work on the ground. It was really mostly focused on these metropolitan areas, and local accountability was very limited because it was actually a centralized system where one political party always won the election. So even though it had a very progressive formal democratic constitution, in reality there was very little accountability from the bottom up. And as a result, the outcomes were quite weak. Things started to change a little bit around 1965 when India faced this food security crisis, where they were basically at a point where if the US had stopped food aid, millions of people would have died of hunger. It was clear that India was not able to feed its population. And this created a motivation to do something. So India started these big investments in electrification so that they could provide the inputs that these new green revolution high yield plants would need. So these plants have this trade-off, right? They produce much more yield per hectare than the traditional alternatives, but they also consume a lot of water and fertilizer. That created a very strong motivation to electrify so that farmers could pump groundwater from the ground to feed the crops so that the crops could feed the people, and this is where the motivation came from. Institutional capacity also improved because the government now had 20 years to build some kind of a bureaucratic system. It still wasn't kind of as strong as you would want, and it had all kinds of issues with kind of corruption and lack of resources and so on, but there was at least some kind of a system for this. Accountability remained very low. It was always thought of as a centralized top-down infrastructure challenge. After the year 2003, the government made a big commitment where they said that we're going to include electricity in what is known as a kind of a minimum basic service package. The idea was that every Indian should have access to some very minimum commodities and services, and electricity was one of them. And at this time, this really became a big political issue. One of the interesting kind of telltale signs of this is that when the Congress party lost the election to the BJP party, Prime Minister Modi's party, in 2014, one of the things that Prime Minister Modi did is they took the same electrification program with the Congress party. They replaced the name Rajiv Gandhi, which is a household name in the Congress party, obviously, with an obscure 1950s freedom fighter or some kind of a spiritual leader from the BJP. They continued exactly the same policy, but they rebranded the program. So this is a very telling sign because it shows that at this point the political calculus is that you have to keep going down this road. If you now start saying, oh no, we we are not going to electrify the villages, we are not going to help the rural population, you would face serious political backlash. And so what you see then is you see these improved outcomes, but at the same time, we think partly because of this lack of local accountability, there's a lot of inefficiency in the system. It's basically this one-size-fits-all approach, which does work over time with brute force, but it means that the costs are too high. They don't really take into account the local conditions. The sort of idea of optimizing between decentralized, solar, and grid is quite limited, and in many cases the quality of the service remains quite limited. Bangladesh at the same time had great success with these rural cooperatives, where the local people come together and they agree on what is the right electricity price, how much service are we willing to pay for, and so on. India did none of that, and that's one of the reasons why India did a lot less compared to where they should be based on population density, GDP per capita. Okay, so that's the India story that I want to communicate. Now, we have a number of other cases. I'm not going to walk you through all of them because there's quite a few of them. So we have 11 cases beyond India that we did, but I do want to note a few patterns here. One really interesting one is what's happening in these authoritarian Asian countries. So it turns out, for example, that China actually started making rapid progress in electrification in the 1950s. Okay? This is 30 years before the economic reforms really kick in. They were the first decentralized power generation nation with this tens of thousands of small hydroelectric dams everywhere in the countryside. So China is a great example of a country that if you just look at it authoritarian, especially in the Mao era, very tight political control, turns out they had very good local accountability mechanisms for this particular purpose. They had these village committees that had the ability to make investments. They collected money from the farmers. They gave them power based on their contributions and all that. So China was actually a very impressive story where you really have to dig a little below the surface. You can't just look at the formal political institutions to understand this. Vietnam, if anything, is a even more incredible story. After the Vietnam War in 1975, Vietnam's electrification rate is maybe 1%, right? So even if you go to the two major cities, so that would be back then Saigon and Hanoi, even in those cities, most people had no electricity because the war had destroyed almost everything, the bombings, the warfare, all that. But over time, especially late 1980s, early 1990s, working with the World Bank, they did this big investment, what they call the backbone. So Vietnam is a very funny looking country. It's this kind of thin stripe on the coast. They literally built this huge transmission infrastructure that looks like a fish bone. From the south to the north, and then they used that to electrify the villages. They had a lot of local engagement. They were able to stimulate rural electricity demand as a result, and very successful. Again, communist country, authoritarian system, on surface looks like this is probably going to be pretty bad, but if you look at how things were actually done on the ground, it's quite an impressive success story. There are many other examples here that we could look at. I want to highlight one of them before I move into the final part of the presentation. That is Senegal. So Senegal is probably the only country in this system that has done better with cooking than with electricity. The problem with cooking is, first of all, it's a challenging behavioral issue. So how to get people to not cook with firewood is complicated. But I think equally important, the governments really just don't have a direct interest in solving this problem. Indoor air pollution, even though it's actually a really major public health threat, is not a political theme in most of these countries. Now it's sort of slowly starting to emerge, but that's one of those issues that tend to come mostly from sort of enlightened activists and the public health community rather than indigenously from the local population. And the government, as a result, doesn't really have any direct benefit, the same way, for example, improving food security would be. So this is why cooking has been difficult, but Senegal, interestingly, in the 1970s and 80s faced such a major threat of deforestation that there was real concern that the country's erosion rates would reach such a high level that they would not be able to survive. So the government made a big push to get some of these cleaner cooking fuels, again, more on the fossil fuel side, so liquefied petroleum gas, butane, and so on, into the countryside. They worked with some private developers, and they were actually able to push these things through while their electrification program failed. And that was because they had this almost an existential crisis in Senegal. It's one of the most interesting cases where things work the opposite way than you might initially expect. Okay? So this is basically the core story of the book. So what we found is that government interest is the starting point. You need to have some kind of a motivation for the government. It can be political, it can be economic. If that's lacking, then it's very unlikely that any kind of external intervention would make a lot of progress. Beyond that, you need the institutional capacity, and we found local accountability mechanisms to be a very important driver of rapid, cost-effective progress on this. I'm sure we will have an opportunity to then discuss specific policy designs and things like this, but we think it's very important to have this broad overview of the basic politics and political economy of the problem, and once we have that, we can then dig deeper into specific policy designs. Thank you very much for your attention, and I certainly welcome any discussion or debate.
Great, Johannes. Thank you for that summary of your book. I know there's a lot more information in the book itself, but obviously, you know, you touch on this very important issue of the relationship between success and access, and this probably relates to development policies as a general proposition, and what is the nature of the political system we're looking at, and the political system at both the national level and how it actually manifests itself at the local level. I was struck by a comment you made about Latin America, where obviously there has been great successes in terms of moving forward the access agenda. I guess one of the notable exceptions to that is Haiti, where there are about, I think, 7 million people without access. Access rates at about 40%. And I hope, Michelle, based on your experience in Haiti, you'll be able to draw out some of the lessons from that. So please, Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. I have to say I'm expressing my views, not those of the World Bank. I'm required to say this. So, thank you very much for your book. It was very interesting to read, and many things in it resonated with me very much. I come to this as a practitioner, not as a theorist. So my job is mostly actually to work on the segment of the countries that are not where you did most of your research. Most of the countries that I've worked in are countries with high levels of poverty and not necessarily the very, very large ones. So in your slide on sub-Saharan Africa, the belt in the middle of the Sahel is where I spend most of my time, and worked on a number of programs on the entire chain from generation to distribution, both rural and on-grid electrification, as well as energy sector reforms. I thought it was very interesting that you, coming at it from a very practical perspective, very pragmatic perspective, and having worked with governments trying to solve these problems, I always find it very interesting to look at these cleaner models where you're drawing conclusions about what works and what does not work. I think our experience, in particularly across these countries, is that one, it's a very, very important topic for many, many reasons, not just because it is in and of itself energy poverty, as Philippe said, for many people is considered a basic right, or basic energy access, a basic right, but also because of the multidimensional aspects of poverty and the fact that it's a gateway. The access to electricity generates access to other benefits that are quite immediate, and we see it very clearly, for example, reflected in other sectors like lighting and light bulbs, or having the possibility to study will have an impact on educational outcomes, particularly for younger children. We find the same thing for income generation. When there's a certain level of quality of the electricity services that become available, particularly in self-employment. We see a lot of impacts on connectivity, the village electrification you were speaking about when you say, you know, of course there's not enough penetration at the household level. The very first thing that people do in a village is set up a place to charge cell phones and any computerized or digital equipment they may have, even in very, very, very poor areas, such as in Central Africa or in the Sahel. All of these elements allow people access to better governance, access to services they wouldn't already otherwise have through ICT, through information communication technology. And also, for example, on the clean cooking issues, the correlation between maternal health, women's health, in particular women's health, And I want to mention here that there's really a gender dimension to the fact that this agenda is not as prominent as it should be, because the correlations are extremely clear with women's health and air pollution, with a disproportionate impact on poor women who have the least voice to raise this agenda. So we find it back in the political economy that you were pointing to. So what I wanted to say also is that, of course, we completely agree. My experience also shows that governance matters, especially along both dimensions, both interest and effort of what the government wants to do to resolve this problem, how much research or activity goes into this. The prioritization of electrification is a very important factor of obviously the outcome. And then there's a second element of capacity. These are not always the same. You have high capacity environments where the intensity of the objectives that are set, the ambition of the objectives is not necessarily very high. You also have the opposites. You have very high ambitions. If you look at, for example, the Haiti example, you will see a very ambitious plan on paper, which has not come to fruition in the last 20 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is and what issues are there. I think also the capacity issue is linked also to delivery mechanisms. You need capacity, you need government capacity, but in a lot of areas we see the implementation of solutions by other actors when in fact the government leaves the space open. So you will see a lot of small startups, you will see people trying to generate electricity on a for-profit basis on the side. You will see solar and other solutions, renewable solutions being developed, even though they're not very structured and they're maybe not very significant based on your very large numbers on your big map, but they are actually helping penetrate those areas where there's really a desert of service. I think accountability really helps, whether it's local or more centralized. You know, India's very big. I've worked in Haiti, is very centralized, but also relatively small. So accountability really matters. And you were talking about the political issues. I don't know if you guys have been watching the news lately. There have been riots in Haiti for the last 8-9 days. There have been a number of dead. The essential fundament for these riots is government accountability, notably the stealing of resources from the Petrocaribe Fund, which is a Venezuelan fund, which is purposefully set up to provide resources in part also to generate electricity in Haiti. So this governance issue on both electricity access and energy policy in general is really very salient, and you see in Haiti the connection immediately, whether it's on petroleum pricing changes or on the raising of prices of electricity, which is one of the reasons this doesn't happen very often. Accountability also helps sharpen delivery mechanisms. So we see it if at the grassroots, and I saw this in Mali when I worked in Mali, at the grassroots, the delivery mechanisms are influenceable by people. You can also make adjustments in the efficiency of the delivery and the nature of the delivery. So that's very helpful. I do, however, think that there are two other elements that really matter a lot in delivering the access that Philippe was talking about. And particularly in countries where governance is weak and accountability is low, because that's where we have the biggest challenges. The last mile issues, you know, who are the poorest people, who will be the last people who will receive electricity, these people are in countries where governance is weak and accountability is low. And some of the questions are for us, for our work in Haiti, was how do we get around these issues in order to be able to deliver electricity? Well, one thing we found was that the math has to work. There are only a limited number of resources available to finance expansion. And those resources are held by different interests and in different pockets, if you like. If you put them all together in one big pot, you might very well be able to finance your expansion. But the system is not organized in such a way that these resources are fungible and that you can use them easily. And I'll give you an example. For instance, in Haiti, we have, 7 million people out of 10 million, or 6.5, we don't know exactly how many, we don't have a good census, so, who don't have access. Of those the great majority are in rural areas, where the penetration rate's about 11% and has been so for over 20, I would want to say even 25 years. Hasn't moved in the rural area at all. Any gains we've seen are in urban areas which are becoming increasingly urbanized. So people are going to electricity. Electricity is not coming to them. Where about 65% of the coverage, of 65% of people have coverage. So we still have 35% of people in urban areas, highly dense urban areas. If you've ever seen a picture of Port-au-Prince, it is very, very dense. Think favelas in Brazil, for example, similar image. In that area, 35% of people don't have any access. So it's really the penetration is very low. The electricity company is losing essentially 60 cents on the dollar of generated electricity. So, and most of these are commercial losses, not technical losses. So it's not leaking of the fibers or leaking of the lines. It's essentially the fact that electricity that is generated is not paid for. And this is not because poor people in the slums are stealing the electricity, which they are all splicing. There are all kinds of wires everywhere. But it is because the largest consumers in the country are not paying. So this is really a corruption and governance issue. And of course, you can imagine that without being able to crack that, if you expand access, you're generating more electricity for people to use, but you're expanding your gap by 60 cents on the dollar. So this was the problem that we faced. What do we do to expand this access without creating a bigger fiscal gap than was already there, which is the subsidy is about 2% of GDP per year. So that's, several hundreds of millions of dollars, and which Haiti can very ill afford. So the question was really, how do you unbundle this? And is there a way to improve the performance of the company while expanding the coverage? And we tried to do this I worked myself on this program for about 8 years, and we ended up stepping back from it and saying, this is not a way that we can develop this, and looking to decentralized solutions to implement solutions for people to have access and find other ways of being able to separately and outside of the centralized system to be able to expand the access. One of the reasons for this is that it became very, very difficult because of the political economy of the environment to get these improvements in the company. Despite about $100 million of investment finance on the table as a, how should I say, sweetener for making these adjustments, and the installation of meters and all kinds of technical things that are required to follow the proper billing of the electricity costs. The ironic thing is that poor people, basically the natural reaction when you hear a story like this is to say, poor people can't pay and they don't want to pay, and this is why the electricity is not being paid for. But in fact, poor people are paying not the company, but other people for access, so they are paying. The willingness to pay is very deep, and actually the installed self-generation capacity, so whether you have a small generator or whether you have several households that have a small generator together, is about equivalent to what is installed in the entire rest of the country. So you have as much on the grid as you do off the grid, because people are looking for solutions outside of that. So I just wanted to underline that in these very poor governance environments, these centralized systems don't really generate the benefits, and that people are trying to find other solutions to go around it, and actually can become very, very significant in terms of available electricity, available capacity. The other thing I wanted to say is that the biggest challenge is actually not the resources. Very often, or at least in my experience, very often people think, oh, these countries are poor, they can't find the investment necessary to expand sufficiently. And in fact, it is often possible to find concessional finance or a combination of concessional public and private finance to expand. The difficulty is changing from a low equilibrium system where some people have interests in keeping the system the way it is, or where there's not enough interest to disturb the system, to move that into a new model. It's really a change. It's really a change issue. It takes a long time to generate the kind of momentum, the kind of political backing, the kind of openness that is needed also simply for change. It's very, very difficult. I've seen that not just in Haiti, but in a number of other sub-Saharan African countries where I've worked, similar issues in Chad and Burkina Faso, similar issues. And then the final thing I would say is that the choice of technology actually matters, and it matters for reasons of sustainability. It doesn't matter in the short term, and I think in your summary you say this may be not something one should focus on. Perhaps if one focuses more on the intent and delivery mechanisms, you get better results. But technology choices really do matter. This is in the long term, the cost of generation through petroleum products is very high. It exposes countries to very high levels of shock. Every time petroleum prices fluctuate. This also reverberates through the political system, makes them more unstable, and makes it more difficult for policymakers in those environments who are already very constrained to keep long-term policy choices, steady. The other thing is that in the long term, how much it costs to generate really, really matters. So if you're able to find concessional finance in that model I was talking about to pay for upfront investments, if your long-term sustainability costs are lower, which is true with renewables in general, I would venture to say, you're really putting the country on a better footing to sustain that for a longer period of time. And you're also lowering the cost over time. The problem is you need the upfront investment, and you need to make that shift. So technology is actually, I think, a key factor. It is also a key factor at household level, and I don't think we should discount, because we talk a lot about big systems and we look at big numbers. Electrification has, even if it's an off-grid, tiny mini-grid that's promoted by an NGO, it's not great from a systemic perspective because it's not the most efficient solution, and economists don't like it because they like to have perfect world, right? But it makes such a significant difference, and there are so many of these initiatives out there. We're not good at collating them and saying how much of an impact this really has on the environment for the people, the users, the end users of these systems. So, a few thoughts.
Right. Thank you for those insights. We understand they're not the World Bank perspectives, but clearly they're informed by your experience, I would sort of say. A couple of important takeaways. I think this issue, when we talk about local accountability, is thinking about what actually defines local. And clearly local is going to be closer in Haiti than it is going to be in India, at least towards the central government. And I think the other important point that you made is that poor people who do not have access actually pay a lot for electricity in terms of batteries and things like that. One of the themes that I think came from both of your discussions is this issue of governance, and I have a question about that before we open it to the audience. But before I do that, I'd like you also to think about a topic we may come back to too. One is how big is gender in terms of the inability to actually make inroads on this clean cooking issue. And the second one is, Johannes, but it applies to both of you, and maybe a little tongue-in-cheek. So I understand that the Soviet states did well in terms of access, and you had China doing well in terms of access in Vietnam. So how much is this correlated to being a communist regime versus some other type of political system? But the real question I wanted to ask for you at this point is, recognizing that governance clearly is relevant, a very important driver for improving access, and actually for a variety of other development services, how do you actually overcome a weak governance environment? So Johannes, maybe, then Michelle.
So I think I would like to break this weak governance environment again into two parts. One is interest and the other one is capacity. I think interest is really hard to change it. I don't think it's realistic for an external actor or agency to think, okay, I'm going to go to a national capital, I'm going to convince somebody that they need to be more interested in something. Those motivations come from more deeper, more fundamental considerations, and they're probably hard to look at. So one of the things we conclude in the book is that the right strategy would be rather to look around and see where do you find governments who are truly committed to making a difference and then helping them, instead of trying to convince all governments that they need to do it. On the capacity side, that is also very difficult because what you're trying to do is you're trying to build capacity that is sustainable. So this is capacity that doesn't go away as soon as the consultants fly back to DC or wherever it is that they're coming from, and at the same time that is deep enough that it can solve these rather intractable problems, whether it's technology or local accountability mechanisms. These are not easy things to solve, and there's no obvious kind of training course, right? That there's no for-credit course that how to solve problems in the power sector in a difficult governance environment. My limited experience, I think Michelle probably has much more experience actually doing this, but at least in India, what I've found most useful is that if you find agencies that are struggling with these electricity distribution companies in the Indian states, the key is often is finding somebody in some position of authority who wants to make a difference. There's always going to be somebody there who is actually a kind of an enlightened public servant who wants to make a difference, and then work with them because they know how the system works. Some support often goes a long way in that context. So I think in the end it comes down to finding somebody who wants to make a difference and then supporting their efforts with everything you have. I think that's a more likely model to work than designing some kind of a training package, going in, giving the training package, going back, and then expecting great results.
Michelle?
I actually think that I agree. I think it's hard to develop interest, but I do think that you have a lot of tools nowadays to be able to develop champions and give proper information. We found a lot of shifts in policy come from presenting good analysis of the information and making clear what the trade-offs are. You're paying 25 cents per kilowatt hour for your electricity. The 2,000 top biggest consumers are paying less than that on average. You can clearly show, if you show the pattern of payments, you can clearly show who are the privileged, who benefit, and who are the ones who end up subsidizing the others. And if you make that information public, you can generate interest for reform that is non-political, and also try to develop some form of championing of a cause or of certain outcomes, certain types of policy. So I actually think it's possible to develop interest. It takes time, and it's nonlinear. It can work, not work. I mean, it's really not very easy to do. It's more an art than a science, perhaps. On the capacity side, I mean, I work for an institution that believes in capacity building and that believes that once you can put the capacity in place, I think it's very difficult. I do think that what is very successful is to look at where things have been successful and to put all the models on the table for any government who wants to work on something like this and say, okay, these are the many different types of avenues that you could follow. Which ones fit your constraints best? How do we build that capacity? There are natural limits to it, because if you do not have, and this, I'll take an example from the health sector, which is maybe more obvious. If you have 10 physicians in the country and you really need 30, you need those 20 that you're missing. There's just no other way around it. But institutional capacity can also be developed if the institutions are specific enough to that particular task. So if you isolate it, then we find it's easier to develop the capacity. At least that's my experience.
Great, thanks. So what we're going to do a little differently here is, I must admit, I also have about 25 years
Yes.
working on access at the World Bank and the IDB, so I'm just going to throw in some comments as well. I won't say I agree with what both of you said, because that'll get a little boring, but I will say something that actually tends to happen is there is a certain name and shame dimension that plays as well. People care about the neighborhood in which they live in, and I say this as countries, and actually you do see that countries are becoming increasingly influenced by what they perceive their neighbors are doing and what other people are saying about them. And sometimes that's motivating countries to, for example, deal with the access issue. There's a lot more information out there about access. You can now point and sort of see who's doing well, who isn't doing well, and that's having an interesting sort of psychological impact on some of the leaders. So it's sort of soft power, it's kind of strange power, but it is somehow seeming to have some type of impact. What I'd like to do at this point is open it to the audience. If I could ask you to raise your hand. We have a mic. If you could just introduce yourself, and if you can make a brief question or comment, that would be great. So, sir, over there.
Hi, thank you for that. So you talked about governance and technology, and so we're talking about looking in the past. You have coal, you have large-scale hydro, and you have natural gas, and we're moving to small scale. Do you think that the role of the private sector can take over that governance and overcome it? And looking in the past doesn't actually help us, because if we have solar plus battery plus wind, the private sector can actually do everything without the government.
So I think, first of all, your caveat is very important in the sense that looking to the past is a little difficult, because right now is the time when these new technologies are appearing, and now is the time when the private sector can make a difference in this area. But at least looking at some of the countries where we've seen the private sector and the civil society come into play, I think you still need governance. So one of the big challenges that you would face in a country where a private sector wants to make a go at, let's say, distributed renewable energy or something, is there's all these policy and regulatory uncertainties. What are going to be the import tariffs for solar panels? What are the regulations? What are going to be legal pricing regimes? If the government lacks the ability to design those policies in a proper way, the private sector is really going to be in a bind. They are hesitant to make large investments because they have no idea what's coming, and that stems from lack of capacity. The other side of this is that sometimes the private sector efforts tend to have this kind of temporary impact that is then, in some sense, it becomes redundant over time. So Bangladesh is a great example. 5 years ago, people were celebrating this big solar home system program that Bangladesh had, with tens of millions of people gaining access to electricity through home systems. Today, if you look at Bangladesh, everybody has a grid electricity connection. So all that this big program with billions of dollars of funding achieved is that it gave people electricity access a few years before the government program came in and achieved the same goal. So I would say that technology and private sector change the nature of governance, and they can make things easier. Kenya is a good example of a country where the private sector has made a huge contribution through new technology, but they don't entirely remove the need for governance, because private sector needs some kind of an enabling environment to do their job right.
You have more to say about this.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
something.
I mean, I think I was interested in listening to you, Johannes, and I think you made a very important connection at the very end, which is that there's a strange relationship between the choice of technology, the delivery mechanism, and then some influence on governance. Because what happens is, if you're in your traditional model, essentially vertically integrated utility, everybody's dependent on, and basically that central vertically integrated utility is going to be the government. So everybody's dependent on the government to give them their electricity service, and everybody's dependent on the government for everything. And what you have found has happened is, because in part this emphasis on smaller scale decentralized systems, the parties that are often best able to deliver that tend to be the private sector. So then all of a sudden you have individuals who are now not only just dependent on the government, they're now dealing with private sector entities who also have a different relationship with the government. And you have in some ways a multiplication of the type of critical actors in the area, and that tends to have an impact on governance. Whether it's sustainable over the long term is a different issue, but you do have this funny situation where, as much as I asked how can you change governance, sometimes the choice of technology has an indirect impact on what's happening on the governance side. Sorry, Michelle, did you want?
No, I just want to say one more thing on that, is that if the governance environment is so unpredictable that even though the market to be developed is huge, the unmet demand is huge. Like in Haiti, the unmet demand is huge. The ability to pay is actually quite high. But the uncertainty in the environment in terms of how the government will behave, even if the regulations are more or less in place or are you can go around them. So basically there's a monopoly on distribution, except for communities. So if you were to do it at the community level, you could distribute privately at the community level. And the unmet demand is enormous. But the uncertainty on the governance side and the uncertainty on the overall governance is too high, even if you have completely free pricing. So the risk is still, in that environment, you can see that governance is really the constraint, right? Because all the other elements are there. That's not necessarily true if you're going to Ghana or if you're going to be working in Kenya, or then you may have a level of risk that's somewhat lower. Then it becomes more unclear whether it's the profitability rather than the risk that drives, and the long-term vision on expansion. Right, like you see with cell phone markets also. They started one place in Africa and then took a whole piece of market. This is the same idea, that you have to have a long-term view of whether your investment, especially if you're not a homegrown company, whether your investment makes sense.
I agree with you about the power of soft shame, and I think that accountability is very important. Can you talk a little bit about what are the most effective accountability measures, especially not just from an outcomes perspective, but also from a soft perspective, right? Because essentially we're talking about changing behavior and fundamental mindsets, right?
So the models that we've seen are effective often combine two directions of accountability. One of them is the traditional, that you hold the government accountable. So you have some kind of a grievance mechanism. The local population has some ability to come together and make proposals and demand certain kinds of interventions, whether it's technology, whether it's pricing, and so on. So that's one direction, is holding the government accountable. But the other one is also then holding the community accountable. So many countries, good examples, this would include Vietnam and Ghana, actually had explicit mechanisms where the local communities need to come up with a certain investment to get access to electricity. In some cases, that investment is money. That works well if you are talking of a lower middle income country that has some capacity. In other cases, Vietnam being a good example of this, when those accountability mechanisms were created, they realized that the local people would not realistically be able to give money to this work, but they can give labor because they can work. And so what they did said that if enough people in these villages contribute their labor to help with these works, then we will facilitate and accelerate the electrification, and that resulted in this very rapid expansion of electricity because the communities were willing to do this and they found good uses for the electricity. So I think the key thing with accountability mechanisms is that they have to work in a sense both ways, that they have to empower the community to change their behavior, and they also have to make sure that the government then follows up by doing the right thing.
I'll take a prerogative to also respond to that. I mean, it's interesting when you look at the way the World Bank dealt with these issues over the last 20 years. You saw an evolution. First thing was information. So, sorry, can you hear? Sorry. So the first way was information, was to provide information, and that tended to help to improve accountability. But then people realized it didn't do enough. So then the next step was consultation, was to actually ask people what they thought. And then the final step was participation. And I think you see that reflected in everything that Johannes has described. So these are ways to basically enhance accountability through these three different mechanisms. And that's what you've seen, for example, the World Bank has done across a variety of development policies, including on environmental and social issues. But I think another issue that's important, coming back to soft notions, and it's something that's not, I don't think it's in this book of yours, Johannes, but it's in another research effort that you've done, which is the issue of trust. If you can enhance trust between the community, the beneficiaries, and the service providers, then you have a much more fertile ground to have high levels of success. So there's the issue of accountability, which is a certain sort of legalistic dimension, and then there's the issue of trust, which is also fundamentally very important. And I know you did some interesting research on this in India, which showed that many of the rural electrification programs had a better outcome where there was a higher degree of trust between the community and the service providers.
Hi. It strikes me that over the course of this talk, we've spoken a lot about electrification, and not that much about cooking fuels, right? And so I guess to your point about choice of technology, last I've heard, there's not been really much progress made in terms of electricity used for cooking fuels, and so the importing of fossil fuels tends to be a core element for energy scarce countries to facilitate that. And so, to your point, if we're trying to improve access to cooking fuels via LPG or let's say even natural gas, aren't countries that don't produce their own always going to be at the whims and mercies of the global market for this stuff and contribute to this perpetual cycle of scarcity? And as an ancillary, what can we do to solve that? And number two is that obviously has a much more difficult logistics chain because it's very difficult to decentralize, right? You need to get from point A to point B. You can't just create an inverted grid. You can't just produce LPG out of nothing. So is there merit in the idea of trying to nudge people, especially in areas where there isn't really an economic reason for a large community to be based there, to try and urbanize, right? To help improve their state of the world in that regard, right? To move to areas, even if it's smaller urban centers, because if you look at sort of, and again, I'm going to hark back to history here, but I feel like in this regard, it's actually relevant. Western Europe or the US or even the Soviet Union, they used to be consolidated in sort of smaller cities that were built around industrial centers. So it's easier to provide these basic access problems.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, so cooking fuels is actually a different, cooking fuels really essentially what you need is, if you're going to use liquid gas, is essentially a market, right? Because the distribution mechanism, market-based, you have to create a market. And if Senegal managed to do this, it's not so easy because you have all the fossil fuel import pricing issues, you have delivery mechanisms, you don't have any streams of distribution, the stuff is heavy, it's not easy to, and it has some danger to it as well. So it's altogether quite difficult. Maybe one of the reasons it's very difficult to do. There's not a lot done on, although I have seen some solar cooking pots, solar cooking mechanisms. They don't seem to be considered as functional, and that's maybe also a behavior change issue, that there's not enough invested in behavior change in this sector. It's not just technology and markets, it's also behavior change. And I don't think we really know, at least, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but I don't think we really know what are good solutions. The other thing I wanted about urbanization is already happening very, very rapidly, right? I think the problem is that, and in Haiti you can really see this because it's going very, very fast. You're creating worse urban environments for people to live in than the rural environments that they've left. So you're coming to different set of, there's a level of vulnerability is increasing. People are living in areas that are flood-based, in areas where it's not appropriate to build, in areas where there's a large concentration of people, so you're exchanging the scarcity of certain services for the risk of other things, like cholera or overcrowding and violence, because there's a level of violence much higher in cities. And that's very clearly demonstrated in the Caribbean. The data for that is unassailable. So, especially for youth, if you have very large young population, you really have this urbanization issue brings with it other challenges. May solve the fuel issue, but has significant other downsides. And it's happening anyway, so.
Yeah, so I'll follow up on the fossil fuel example. I think there's been very few cases where anything else than a gas-based solution has actually made progress. So one very interesting case is Ecuador, where they actually had such generous gas subsidies that they're now trying to encourage people to adopt induction stoves just so that they no longer have to pay those gas subsidies. So this is an example of a very policy gone wrong, right? Another super interesting case is Nepal. So when India imposed this trade ban on Nepal and said because of the constitutional changes that discriminated against the kind of ethnic Indians in Nepal, they were left without access to cooking gas. So now there's a lot of interest in using microhydro to encourage electricity in the country. But in most places, gas has been the main alternative to firewood, including India. In terms of the fossil fuels, I'm a little less concerned about the high-level sort of macro stability, because that's always going to be there. All of these countries are dependent on oil in one way or another today, just because of transportation. But I do think that there is a real risk that if the price of oil goes up and the prices of these cooking fuels go up, if the government cannot subsidize, you would have these reversals, where households that were moving in the right direction actually go back and start using firewood. So I think it's a point well taken in that sense. On urbanization, I agree with this view that it's happening in any case, it's happening pretty fast. I think the key challenge is how do you govern it so that urbanization creates huge opportunities, but to really capitalize on them, you need governance, right? So you have to find a way to design these towns in a way that is productive and useful and healthy for the people.
Any other questions there?
We can hear you.
No, I think maybe
Doesn't work, actually.
because they're taping you too.
Oh, they're taping
Is
it.
it? It's not working.
It's not working.
Okay.
So you were talking about governance in terms of lack of clarity and lack of credibility on government, what exactly their work will be and so on. And perhaps I'm projecting from work we did in the research. Sometimes that lack of accountability is there by design, right? And so my question is to all three of you, do you have specific examples within countries and within research where you look at the vested interests that stop the power sector from developing? You can think for various reasons, whether it's generator owners, whether it's not willingness to bill certain constituents, people who want to keep fueling power stations in a certain way, thinking especially oil in the Middle East, for example. So there's a lot of reasons to think that, you know, some stakeholders do not want to see the power sector develop. So just your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I'll start. I can give you two examples. So, I mean, I think something that's very important when you're thinking about these countries from a governance perspective, and it's something Johannes touched upon, is there are some countries where you have a massive governance problem. I think a lot of what Johannes was talking about, as he mentioned, I think he alluded to it in his presentation, were those countries that were like above that level. So Senegal, Ghana, countries that seem to be making an effort to deal with their governance issues. So let me give you two examples of countries that I've worked on that are below the threshold. One is Haiti. There was not a serious attempt there to really deal with their governance issue. And what happens, we talked about the private sector and how the private sector can promote improved governance. Well, in Haiti, you have the opposite situation on this, which is that basically you have a lot of IPPs that were set up in Haiti, private producers, and one of the things that happened is they sell electricity to the state-owned utility, but nobody knows exactly how much electricity they're selling. The utility's paying for it, but nobody's clear on how much. So there was a discussion about putting in meters at these places, and lo and behold, they put in these meters and they all burnt up or whatever. So basically, you had this situation where there were vested interests, powerful families in the Haitian geopolitical context that own the IPPs, own the generators, and there was a total lack of interest in actually providing transparency in that regard. So that's a clear, on both sides.
On both sides of that equation.
Both sides, and both sides are actually closely interrelated. So that, I think, is an illustration of a situation where your governance standard is so poor that it becomes extremely difficult to get to the point where what Johannes was talking about. The other thing that's relevant in that regard is then people say, oh, what you need to do is you need to diversify, bring in other actors and things like that. But then you get into this general issue, well, at some point the private sector needs some minimum, you know, the smaller private sector that's not connected to the government needs some degree of transparency and the like, and guess what? There are a lot of vested interests that were operating to sort of prevent that from happening as well. Another illustration is actually the Democratic Republic of Congo, where again you have a massive utility that is closely intertwined with the government. The basic objective of the utility is to make sure there's enough electricity flowing to the mining interests so they can produce it. And other than that, there didn't seem to be much of an interest. Having said that, and if you follow the politics in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there have been some shifts. There is some sort of name and shame and what's going on with the neighbors that arguably is pointing to some increased improvement there. One can always remain optimistic. I will say this on the Haiti situation, and I say this, my father was from Haiti. Haiti is a little complicated in part because what is the role of the United States in all of this? So it becomes a very complicated dynamic when you're looking at what's happening in Haiti. And some of the problems obviously are internal to Haiti, but some of it are also because you have some massive interests outside of Haiti that also maybe aren't always playing a productive interest in terms of promoting improved governance within Haiti?
So I'll give two examples from South Asia. The first one you know very well. In India, obviously, the agricultural producers are a major challenge. For them, it's not really that important if the electricity is entirely reliable, as long as you have 8 hours of supply to run the pumps at some point, it's okay. And they have managed to convince many state governments to make the electricity free for them. It's kind of hard to have a well-running, efficient distribution company if their main product is sold to a huge consumer for free. Another very interesting example is Pakistan. So in Pakistan in the 1990s, when the situation was truly desperate, nobody was willing to invest in the country, they gave these extremely generous agreements, these long-term power purchase agreements with the generators. They said, okay, we can give you 18% returns a year, and we'll give a full sovereign guarantee. So if anything goes wrong, we'll foot the bill. Once you create a system like this today, when Pakistan doesn't need this anymore, they would get generation at half the cost. The generators are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that the government keeps this going. And there's, by the way, quite a few of those generators are owned by government officials and politicians who like making 18% a year with zero risk. I also like, so I asked when I was in Pakistan last month, is there any way I could use my retirement account to buy one of your plants, because this really looks like a great business.
Michelle?
No, just to add, I think you've said everything. I think in Haiti, the interesting thing is that both things are happening. The offtake agreements signed by the independent power producers with the government are extremely favorable to the producers and basically put all the risk on the government. So the government has to is basically paying their take or pay contracts, very, very high prices, and they're they're completely untransparent. So when we try to put meters in to just measure at the output of the IPP, how much are they generating and how much are they transmitting, it was, and there are 4, so maybe we needed 8 physical locations. We made, I'd say, 7 or 8 attempts in 5 years, and we did not succeed in getting the total measure. We did get voluntary measures, which we could sort of reconcile with the load on the grid, but it was not easy. It was really very difficult to do that. So that system is very broken. And the other point was that the distribution company is also actually preventing the expansion of its own space, because inside that distribution company there's an enormous amount of corruption, and people are collecting fees particularly from the poor, in manners that go around the company. So the same thing, metering was tried, was much more successful in residential. We did residential distance metering, which you can also cut off at a distance. So there's no reason for someone to come and actually read your meter, or manipulate your meter, or intimidate you because you need to pay. And that had a very immediate effect, as did, very small little technological thing, direct payment. So people they had an automatic meter, received their bill by phone, it's a pilot, and then could pay directly by direct payment. And that really reduced the space for discretion. But this is more at the micro level. The bigger pieces are at the generation level, I would say. But the vested interests are very significant. Very significant.
Well, that was loud. First, thank you. I guess my question is going to be more specific, case study related, and I'm not sure if you guys have done any studies on this part of the world, but my question is going to be related to the Balkans. So we have a case where energy prices there have been increasing for the past 15 years. And so families during the winter months spend 30 to 40% of their income to pay for heating. So even middle-class families are actually struggling to pay their electricity bills. And usually, this is an example of obviously people and families living in old buildings, which is a pretty significant amount of people. But energy efficiency is obviously extremely low in this case. We have a case from a country that was a socialist society, and now is a capitalist one. So I guess that's one of the biggest struggles as well. So how to, in this case, successfully keep the government reliable? Because I think that has been a real struggle for the past 10 or 15 years. And I'm interested because that's where I'm from.
So, well, first of all, just full disclosure, I haven't done a case study of the Balkans.
I know,
The
yeah.
problem that you are describing in the academic literature is called fuel poverty. So energy poverty is things like not having electricity, not having fuels, whereas fuel poverty is extremely high energy bills. My understanding is that in those cases, the first thing that you have to do is understand why is there no market solution to this problem. So if people are paying large amounts of money, and the people in the Balkans are not poor the same way people in the Sahel are, right? They have funds that they can use. Why is nobody doing anything about it? Why is there no solution to this in terms of improved building quality? What is the problem here? And I've understood that in many places, the solution has then been in some kind of a public-private partnership where you find out what is preventing these investments. I think it's a question of insulation, for example. I can't possibly, coming from Finland, imagine that in the Balkans you would actually have to have that much heating. We don't have that problem in Finland, and I can tell you it's kind of cold there for most of the year. So I think the questions you have to figure out, why are these families unable to make the investments? Then see, is it necessary to have some kind of a maybe partial subsidy or some kind of a change in the legislation, and then work together with energy service companies. Maybe the problem is there are no energy service companies, in which case that might be the solution. But I think understanding exactly why these investments are not happening has to be the starting point, because clearly, in principle, affordability is there. The problem is that you are paying too much in a kind of monthly payments when there would be an investment that would save you lots of money over time. So it's got to be some kind of issue of financing or an imperfect market or lack of information, lack of incentives. There's got to be some specific problem here. It can't be just that people don't have any money at all.
So it's a slightly, first thing is just if I repeat what you said, well, the prices have been going up, right? So one question I would have to ask is, are those prices cost reflective now or not? I mean, were they going up because of something bad that was going on, or were they going up because these were economies in transition and all of a sudden the government decided to stop subsidizing prices? So that's one question, right? There's a psychological dimension there. Now, if we're just going to, I'm just going to assume, let's say they become more cost reflective, which is what one tends to have. Then the question becomes, are those costs too high? And so there you have inefficiencies in the supply chain. You have corruption issues, which drive up the prices and things like that. So those would also be some of the issues to look at. And then I think the third point, clearly, the energy efficiency side. So notionally, one would say that there should be some money to be made in improving the insulation to drive down the costs. And this is the type of thing that often requires some type of government support. And you've seen efforts like that in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, as they have sort of transitioned out of more of a centralized system. So, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development does a lot of energy efficiency projects. But I think often the answer is, on the one hand, has a transition been taking place where basically the government has been removing subsidies that were there before, which is why people are seeing this increase in prices? And the second, are those prices really too high because the costs are too high because some reasons reflect the fact that there are some major governance problems and some corruption issues or failures of the business models sort of to take hold. Okay, great. We have time for one last question. Sorry.
Thank you. I mean, the idea of development is very complicated, and we've been talking about getting power to the world. How do you prioritize? You know, maybe a village needs a water project first. I mean, you bring power in there and no one has phones, or you don't have lights to click on. It just seems like it's, and then you have the governments working against you. I mean, how do you not lose all hope?
Well, you know, it's funny, I'll let them answer and then I'll come back, because one of the questions I had, which is something people are talking about now on the energy side, is are we over-investing, are we over-emphasizing electricity access as compared to other ones? So actually, let me just tell a little anecdote of a story. I was working on, in Colombia, it was a wind project in a very remote area. And they put up all these wind turbines to provide electricity to Bogota, which is the capital. And at a certain point, NGOs from the outside world went in and said, well, actually, there isn't electricity being provided to the people who live under the windmills. And the reason there wasn't electricity being provided to the people who live under the windmills was because, as part of the development project, they had gone to the community and they'd asked the community, what would you like us to invest in? And the community said, we want you to invest in water. So there had been investments made in water, but from a perception perspective, you had this notion, gave a sense of total exploitation. So in fact, I will say, the bank then went in and said, look, you have to give them electricity because it just looks too bad. But what the people had wanted and what they had gotten was water. So sometimes the fact of the matter is, because there's a UN Sustainable Development Goal number 7, there's going to be a lot of emphasis placed on providing electricity access. I happen to think it's a good thing, but clearly it will distort in some ways what's going on in the donor community. But Johannes and Michelle?
So obviously, one thing to do is you can do, an economist could start with a cost-benefit analysis and conclude that micronutrients or vaccinations are the way to go. I think in the real world, it's more likely that it would come through some kind of a political process. And I've seen some very interesting examples where, for example, you have these funds that basically collect royalties from mining or some kind of other specific source of income. And then they actually create these democratic forums where they ask people, what do you want us to do with the money? And they look at people, some of them are very deliberative and elaborate, others are very simple, voting mechanisms. They don't always work perfectly, but those give you a sense of what the local priorities are. And you can then start correcting them. Sometimes the local priorities require some interpretation, because obviously these are people not with like PhDs in economics who will do the cost-benefit analysis, but you can get a rough sense of, like, for example, are people interested in, is water access considered a major problem that's bigger than electricity? And you can ask people to rank things using some kind of, for example, these cue cards that say, like, okay, here's one thing, here's another thing, which of these is more important for you in a daily life? So I think the mechanisms are there to make these democratic and legitimate decisions. It's just that when they're often done on a very high level in international politics, once you start going into this one direction, it's really hard to move away from it. And that's what happened in India, is once you get to the point where this idea that we're going to electrify everybody is out there, which political party is going to say that we are actually not going to electrify everybody? Nobody. And then you are stuck with this idea, regardless of what happens with micronutrients and vaccinations.
Michelle, final word?
I think you hit it on the head. Prioritization is the biggest, one of the most difficult challenges. And as both Philippe and Johannes are saying, the political processes and the real world trade-offs can be done very technically, and then you can also see the political reasoning for short-term immediate needs for the reasons that we were talking about, people in the street, or because certain things are very sensitive at a certain period of time. I actually think that we shouldn't discount one very important factor, to not lose hope, which is that vision actually really matters. So there are all these elements that drag you down into the everyday nitty-gritty. This can't be done because this person is opposed. This can't be done because of this factor. This is unaffordable. This we don't have the capacity to do. But you have a number of countries that really have set visions and are trying to implement these visions. You have a number of international bodies that are trying to set visions. You have a number of grassroots movements that have visions. These visions actually really matter. And if you look at, I think Vietnam is an example, Estonia is an example, Bhutan, which measures its happiness and not its GDP. I mean, you think these are anecdotal, but in fact, I don't believe they are. I actually think that they can have a major influence on where people want to go. It matters actually almost more than where they're able to go. Because if you're not able to see it and make that change, the change in your mind, then it's very hard to go there. And there are still examples of that. And I know it is a controversial one, but I think Rwanda is a very good one, actually, really to look at on a long-term basis. You have a real conscious decision to change. Yes, it has a lot of problems with autocracy, etc. I'm not disputing that. But the desire to change and the idea that you can put a vision and within all of the constraints you can drive towards that vision is actually something that really that case demonstrates quite clearly. I think Ethiopia might be also one of those cases at the moment, where you have a movement that is beyond material. And I actually think that that is perhaps in the future what will matter the most.
Well, I guess then one final related thought is there are fewer poor people in the world today than there were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years. Human development indicators are all up. So, you know, when you look at it in terms of poverty alleviation, we're seeing positive trends. Having said that, from an equities perspective, that there are any poor people, extreme poor people today is a major problem. So, on that note, both positive and negative, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. As I had mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. This is one of a number of great events that we're hosting in the coming weeks. Our next event in New York City is going to be the 2019 BP Energy Outlook, which will take place at the Princeton Club of New York on Tuesday, February 26th from 9:30 to 11, and some of the speakers will include Spencer Dale, who's the BP's Group Chief Economist, and others. We're also going to have an event in Washington, D.C. called the Economic Volatility in Oil-Producing Regions, Exploring Impacts and Public Policy Responses, and that's going to be located at the Resources for the Future and taking place on Thursday, March 14th from 9 a.m. till 12:15. So as you can see, the center really covers a wide array of energy issues. We hope to see you all again, and please join me in thanking our speakers one last time.